Hey everybody, Dan here, and welcome again to that Paintball channel. For this third installment on the Automag, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the updates, upgrades that AGD did to both fix some issues and raise the performance level of what was already a fantastic marker. Now, before we do that, I want to make a technical correction. In a previous video, I noted that the Automag is not a spool valve, that it is a pressure regulated blow forward, and that is true. There's a huge discussion on Simon Stevens' Inception forums. By the way, if you want to get smart, go to that forum. Just some of the smartest people on planet Earth and paintball are there. Great stuff, and you'll learn a lot in a hurry. But this question came up, and there was a huge discussion about it, and I noted that, this has always been understood as not being a spool, and some of the engineers on there were saying, well, it seems like it is a spool, and other engineers were saying, no, it's not really a traditional spool at all. And so it was this huge debate. It went on for pages and pages, and there was a lot of vehemence, and I learned a lot there. But at the end of the day, what it boils down to is the distinction between a spool and a poppet is that the poppet lifts away from the sealing face, and a spool slides along the sealing face. So you imagine you've got a bore and there's an O-ring, and the spool valve will slide in that bore versus a poppet that will lift away. So because the bolt on an AGD Automag, there's a little stem in there, and it, for a brief period, sits inside an O-ring and then it slides out of that. That's what actually seals it. That makes it technically a spool valve, even though it does not operate in any way like a typical spool valve. Most spools will have lands, high spots and low spots, and then they'll shift air from one place to another on the basis of that. And the Automag doesn't do that ever. So it is a completely atypical spool valve, but because it slides along the bore, that makes it technically a spool valve. So just to clarify that. Well, let's get back to the updates. One of the major early updates that AGD had to deal with was an issue of shoot down. We talked about the way in which the marker functioned. Air would come in, it would get regulated down to about 450 psi. That would then push down on an on-off pin, which would then both allow recharge of the dump chamber and also reset the trigger. So that on-off is very important. It simultaneously recharges and resets the system. Very important. So bear in mind that the early on-off setup meant that, and I'll show you one. This is actually an RT on-off valve. And you see how small the cross-section of that pin is there. Very small. And you've got 450 psi acting on that little pin, and that would give you, the trigger pull itself was something like 4 pounds. The reset force was something like 5 pounds. So you get a little kick. It was a decently snappy trigger. It was a nice trigger. But the problem is, remember with the way that the on-off works, so long as you hold this trigger, the system isn't doing anything. It cannot recharge. So what would happen, because you don't have a lot of additional force pushing the trigger back, it's a little more than what what the pull force is. But as you would go to, shoot, if you're shooting really fast, there's a tendency, if you're not exercising good trigger discipline, to sort of ride that trigger. And that means that the valve is not getting a proper recharge. So that's one of the issues. Another issue was that some of the early valves didn't have very large air passages. They were very restrictive. And they were also misaligned in many cases. So AGD would, you could send your valve back and they would index the holes, and then they would drill you a proper hole and it would be fine. And some people would do all these crazy things like this one here. There's a 4-hole mod. They've drilled 4 holes here. I've seen, the most common was the 8-hole. I've seen 10 holes. And I think A&S Gear did one where they would actually machine out almost half of each side. They would just leave 2 little tabs to hold that in there, all in an effort to get more air. Well, as it turns out, none of that really made a lot of difference. The issue had to do with the force that was being exerted on that pin. So what AGD did was something incredibly brilliant. Most regulators, as I said, are, in a previous video, are pre-reg systems. So you've got a regulator, and the air coming in from the tank gets regged down to whatever the operating pressure is, and then that goes in and operates the system. And this was no different. Air comes in, gets regulated first, and then it goes, down to 450 psi, then it goes into the system, etc. And that's great. It's fantastic. If you have good trigger control, it's not really a problem. But AGD did something different. They flipped that system. So instead of having a pre-reg system, they went with a post-reg, basically. You might think of it as, post-reg with mid-reg tendencies, or mid-reg with post-reg tendencies. Basically, they put the regulator last in the system. So now air, tank pressure air, so 850 psi, comes into the valve, but instead of going into the regulator, it bypasses the regulator. It goes straight into the on-off. Now, instead of 450 psi pushing down on that pin, you've got 850 psi. So your reset just went from approximately 5 pounds to almost 10 pounds. About 9.6 if you do the calculations at 850 psi input. Moreover, they stepped the on-off pin, so instead of a continuous diameter pin, they stepped it, which cut the trigger pull in half. So think about this. We go from the original system was 4 pounds pulling force, 5 pounds return force. Now we have a 2-pound trigger pull and a nearly 10-pound reset force. And this is what gave it the name RT, for reactive trigger. So your finger naturally, because your muscles sort of learn how much to pull and you just pull it, well, now the system pushes your finger back faster. This does a couple of things. Having that unregulated air go, through the system, push the valve down, and it fills the dump chamber. So it's filling the dump chamber at full tank pressure. Then it goes into the regulator and gets regulated down, and then it cuts off. So this does 2 things, 2 birds with 1 stone. It increases the reset force, so that makes it very unlikely that you'll be able to choke off that the valve. But it also radically increases the speed with which the valve gets recharged. So to date, this is still one of the fastest recharge valves. At a normal tank input pressure, this recharges at something like 26 times a second. Super fast. And what this did was, this was such a game changer. On the field, people who had a typically slow trigger finger were now able to pull 9 balls a second. In a day when pulling 7 was pretty decent. For somebody who could only pull maybe 7 to be able to now pull 2 more times per second is a huge advantage. And another thing was discovered, namely that the more pressure you put into this, the harder the pin will reset and the faster the dump chamber will recharge. So this led to what is known as the RT effect, or trigger bounce. Now, for a while people thought there's something was wrong, it was runaway, but it's not. It's simply, you can turn this thing into a machine gun, basically. You just sweet spot that trigger, and you can get your trigger finger to just sort of ride that trigger, and it will just reset, and then the system will reset it for you. And the more pressure you feed into this, the faster it goes. Now, to my knowledge, this system has never been fully opened up. Zach Vetter did some videos, check it out online, where he gave an input of something like, I think, 1900 psi into the valve, and he hit something, I think, like 31, roughly, maybe a little higher than that, BPS. That's crazy fast. But remember that these valves are rated to 3000 psi. I'm not aware of anybody actually putting 3000 psi into one of these valves and seeing what it would do. But you do some basic calculations, and that means this valve is capable of going very fast. My guess would be you're getting near 40 BPS in terms of what it can actually feed at, you know. So needless to say, you know, it's a fantastic design. It's really brilliant. It fixes so many problems. And indeed, the faster it shoots, the more consistently it shoots, because the air heats up. It's going through there so fast. The air will heat up and everything sort of steadies out. And this thing is just beautiful to shoot fast. It's really impressive. But it got the attention of you know, the NPPL at the time, and they put the kibosh on it. So they basically banned the RT valve. And even now, you know, now that there's been a big return to mech, usually leagues will frown on these valves just because it's easy to make them bounce so that they just become a machine gun, essentially. Now you can control it, so you let off the trigger and you can stop the bounce. But it's, you know, you can find these on YouTube, look them up, see the videos of people just spraying paint. And it's kind of fun, but for me, I chased that for a while. But once you sort of get there and you can do it, it's really not that big a deal. And it's definitely not something that you want to do in normal play. It's fun in the backyard. It's fun at the chronograph, you know, impress people. But this is not something that you ever want to shoot at another player. I personally got hit with a 20 BPS stream from my own marker, and my buddy was shooting it, and you know who you are, and he striped me up pretty good. I mean, it was funny, I laughed, but I thought to myself, wow, if somebody who wasn't on board with this got hit with this, they could be potentially really annoyed, and legitimately so. I mean, you know, you've just got a continuous welt that runs like a bandolier, you know, down across your body. That's, you know, it could be potentially not a good time. So that was a major thing that AGD did. Another thing, and you'll notice that this is black, essentially. This is 7000 series aluminum. That was another thing that AG did. Because of the weight, you know, this is stainless. This is one of the original classics, of course. Very stainless, very heavy, very durable, but it's heavy. So they went to this 7000 series aluminum. So it's very strong. It's no problem having that kind of pressure in there. It's also rated to 3000, but it lightened it up substantially. And the X valves, which was the next phase, you know, this front portion, as you can see, the back, the regulator area here is what they upgraded to aluminum, but this whole front part is stainless. Well, with the X valves, they made all of that aluminum except for the very tip, because you need the power tube to be stainless to go with the stainless bolt. So that was the biggest, probably, upgrade. The other upgrade came in the form of the level 10 bolt. Now, this marker has a level 10 bolt. I won't take it out because it's got macroline. It's kind of a pain to do quickly. But they wanted to be very gentle on paint. So this is a standard bolt. You know, you've got your air charge. It blows through. Well, it comes out with a decent amount of force. And if you were to stick your finger or a paintball in there, it's going to get hurt. So in about, I think 2001 is when AGD unveiled the level 10 bolt. It was also known as the Super Bolt, but it was basically a low impact bolt, and it was a two-stage bolt. So it had a very thin little pipe, basically. So you see this bolt here has a solid piece. That solid stem seals up in the O-ring, and the pressure acts on that. Well, instead of this big face that's solid, they made a hollow tube, and the hollow tube extends out, and that sits inside the dump chamber. You pull the trigger, and you have the same amount of dump chamber pressure is acting on it, but it's pushing it out very slowly. Moreover, in that tube, in that stem, there's a cross hole drilled, a vent hole, so that when it comes forward in the breech, it's sitting right here. As it moves forward into the breech, if it contacts a paintball that's only partially fed, it will actually vent that gas and reset. So that when you have these things properly set up, you can actually take a rolled up dollar bill, stick it in the breech, and pull the trigger, and it will bounce off of it. They essentially took what was a standard type valve, or bolt rather, and they made a system that was physically incapable of chopping paint. You can't chop paint. It's incredible. In their videos, you can see of Tom K putting his tongue into the breech, pulling the trigger, and it just bounces off of his tongue. It's very gentle. It's weird. The first time I did it, I was like, oh, I'm not sure, and I pulled the trigger, and it just goes twink twink, and it just bounces off of your finger. Very impressive. The other thing they did, because they wanted to get, once electros start coming on the scene, this is getting now 2000, 2001, they wanted to make the trigger pull even lighter. So remember, they took the RT valve and they cut that trigger pull down from 4 pounds to 2 pounds. Well, they made what was known as ULE engineering, which is ultralight, but in that same sort of broad category of time and development, they made what is now incorrectly but widely popularly used as the ULT, the ultralight trigger. And they made the stem even smaller so that the pull force was less than a pound, something like 15 ounces. And they made the top smaller because they wanted to, get away from that reactive effect. And you could actually shim the thing to control the effective pin length, which is kind of what controls the reactivity. So that would allow you to play legally, because you had the ULT, or the ultralight trigger rather, and you could make it so that it's not able to bounce. But it's a very light trigger pull, very fast, and it's pretty impressive. So that was just another thing they did. Some people like them, some people don't. I can kind of go either way on them. I personally like the RT on-off because I like a little more feel to it. I just like that mechanical feel a little bit better. Another thing they did was they got away from the twist lock barrels. We talked about the twist lock last time. Just because so many people, they wanted to just sort of strip everything down. And they also got away from stainless at the same time. So you'll see that this is a center feed stainless. This was sort of, as the bodies are going on the way out, center feed becomes the norm. And they went with this ULE project, which, stripping everything down, making it very, very light. And they made these bodies all aluminum. So now you go from stainless to aluminum. You've cut the weight drastically. And they also made them internally cocker threaded. So now you can use all your normal cocker barrels. Most people who had Automags also had autocockers, even though there's the big rivalry. Most people, myself included, you love them both, and they're both great for very different reasons. But these new bodies would, they would unthread. So now this isn't one of the ULE bodies. This is a stainless body that's had an aftermarket adapter made. But this gives you, the ability to use cocker threads inside it. And that really became, something that people were interested in. Moreover, they changed the detents to ball-style detents, and they didn't have dual detents, but they're very functional. And that kind of was as AGD was coming out. Later, still, they come out with, well, actually, I think maybe even. I'm not sure exactly when the EMAGs came out in terms of the bodies, the ULE. I'm not sure on that. That's kind of outside my area of expertise, and I'm not going to talk about the EMAGs. They're very interesting. They're, mechanically as well as from a design point of view. Very interesting, but I just never got into them, so that kind of is the end of my area of expertise. I stop kind of here. Uh, and I would encourage you to go on, Automag's online. It's the AGD forum, and Tom K gets on there every now and then. A lot of people from AGD who've worked there or still work there. Tuna Man, he's on there, and if you want to know anything about Automags, that is the place to go. I think that's pretty much it for this. I hope that you've learned something interesting. You found this useful, but it's just my way of sort of giving homage to a company that used to be at the very height and now has kind of fallen into a lesser known category as they're still in business, but they're not really producing radically new things, and people just sort of forget about them. But now that mech is kind of coming back, people are getting more interested in them. But they've continued to stay in business. They keep chugging along. They continue to make new stuff, but it's these original designs. But it's a company that doesn't get the credit I think that it deserves, especially now. It used to get the credit that it deserved, but they're just such an amazing marker. And even today, I was talking about how these markers will just function, run and run and run. This valve I've deliberately had with a bad O-ring, and it's been running for a year. It leaks. It's a failed O-ring. It still functions. It's fantastic. I think I'm probably going to just leave it as is and just try to see how long I can run this thing without it messing up. Last time I was out, I had one of my favorite markers. It doesn't matter what it is, but I had it out, and it conked out on me. And out came the Automag, because I know it's going to work. And sure enough, gas it up. It's got the little hisps. It's leaking. Who cares? I played all day with it. It was fantastic. It worked marvelously. So definitely do yourself a favor. If you're not familiar with these, just pick one up. You can pick them up relatively cheap. Classics at the time of this video, you can pick up $100 easy online. You can pick them up new from AGD. They're more expensive, of course. But they're just a wonderful, fun shooting, fast marker. And definitely, if I can give you any advice in terms of upgrading and updates and things, stick with just AGD stuff. You don't need, and you definitely don't even want, for the most part, any kind of aftermarket upgrades. I mean, like a DOX adapter that adapts the original stainless bodies to Cocker threaded barrels. Those are fine. Those are very functional. Go ahead and get one of those if you like. But I mean, it's a marker that basically out of the box needs nothing to run and run great and just be fun. So again, I love these things, and hopefully some of this information may have helped you to love them as well. Who knows, or at least check them out. Hope that was helpful. Thanks, gang.